At 06:47 hours on October 25, 1944, the Philippine Sea was a slate-grey expanse of deceptive tranquility. A morning mist clung to the water like a wet wool blanket. Aboard the USS White Plains, the morning routine was a rhythmic and mundane comfort. The smell of scorched coffee and powdered eggs wafted through the mess decks, while the low hum of the ventilation system provided a constant mechanical heartbeat. In the radar shack, a young operator stared at his search screen, watching a cluster of ghost blips flicker on the edge of the glass. He adjusted the gain, expecting the electronic noise to dissipate, but the blips grew sharper, firmer, and impossibly large. He did not know it yet, but he was looking at the concentrated fury of the Japanese Imperial Navy's center force. Moments later, the mist began to peel back like a theater curtain. The horizon was suddenly dominated by the nightmare silhouettes of pagoda masts. These were massive, tiered structures that seemed to scrape the low-hanging clouds. At the center of this steel forest sat the Yamato, a 70,000-ton Titan. Its 18-inch guns were larger than the entire fuselage of the Wildcat fighters sitting on the flight deck of the White Plains. The silence of the morning was not broken by a shout, but by a sound that several sailors later described as a hollow, metallic echo. It was a deep-chested boom that felt like it originated in the very bedrock of the ocean. Then came the whistling, a terrifying high-pitched scream of displacement as shells the size of Volkswagens tore through the atmosphere. When the first salvos hit the water, they did not erupt in the standard white plumes of naval combat. They exploded in technicolor. To help their spotters track accuracy, the Japanese had loaded their shells with brilliant dye markers. Suddenly, the vulnerable escort carriers of Taffy 3 were surrounded by towering geysers of neon pink, canary yellow, and emerald green. On the bridge of the White Plains, the air tasted of cordite and ozone. The deck beneath the sailors' feet, a mere 3/8 of an inch of unarmored steel, shuddered with a violent and sickening frequency. The Americans were slow, they were unarmored, and they were staring down the most powerful surface fleet ever assembled. They had nothing but a thin grey line of destroyers and their own desperate audacity. But to understand how these men found themselves in the path of a Titan, we must look back to the wood-paneled desperation of the Oval Office years earlier. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, a man with an obsessive, lifelong love for naval tradition, had grown increasingly frustrated with his admirals. He watched the glacial construction timelines of the great shipyards and realized the big ship navy was moving too slow. He looked at the looming shadow of global war and knew the elite fleet carriers would never be built fast enough to plug the holes in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Roosevelt's solution was a radical, almost insulting proposition to the naval establishment. He ordered the Navy to take the humble lumbering hulls of merchant ships and weld a flight deck on top. Admiral Harold Stark dismissed the idea, calling the resulting vessels useless and sluggish. But the president's directive was absolute. The result was a fleet of discarded, technically flawed experiments that would eventually become the Casablanca and Bogue classes. These were ships built on the fly, birthed in the sprawling, cacophonous assembly lines of Henry Kaiser's shipyards. Workers who had never seen the ocean used reciprocating steam engines to power the new vanguard of naval aviation. This was technology that felt like a throwback to the age of Charles Dickens. The crews who manned them were often as green as the ships themselves. They were young men who had traded Midwestern farms for a world of beans and squalor. They lived under the mocking labels of their own service: combustible, vulnerable, expendable. They knew their ships lacked the heavy armor belts of the fast carriers. They knew that a single well-placed torpedo would not just sink them but would turn their unarmored bomb stowage into a blast furnace. The true crucible for these jeeps began not in the tropics, but in the harrowing monochromatic world of the Aleutian Islands. In May of 1943, off the coast of Attu, the crews learned what it meant to operate on the edge of the world. The Aleutian stare became a physical reality for men who spent weeks staring into a sunless, freezing fog, so thick it felt like a physical weight. Sudden, violent winds known as willy-waws would scream down from volcanic peaks. These winds tossed aircraft across the flight deck like balsa wood toys. Pilots, shivering in cockpits that lacked heaters, navigated by the faint, eerie glow of green flares and searchlights. They watched as the wind slammed their comrades into craggy mountain slopes. It was a world of freezing dampness and amateurism, where a ship's own scientific equipment could trigger a submarine panic. This led to hours of radical, nauseating maneuvers in the dark. Yet as the Guadalcanal crisis reached its breaking point, the Navy realized these auxiliaries were no longer a luxury. They were the backbone. While the fleet carriers were being picked off in the hornet's nest of the Solomons, the jeeps were the ones delivering the planes and the parts that kept the Marines fighting in the mud. They were the ones who stayed when the big ships had to withdraw. By the time the USS Long Island launched its first combat mission on August 20th, 1942, the transformation was complete. The jeep carrier had evolved from a discarded experiment into an indispensable workhorse. It was a platform where pilots sweated and prayed during every landing. They knew their ship was a two-torpedo death trap, yet they refused to yield. They were the Pony Express of the Pacific, bridging the gap between logistics and the raw, visceral squalor of the front line. They were heading toward a destiny that would eventually bring them back to the technicolor nightmare of Samar. By late 1943, the Pacific War had entered a phase of violent, experimental transition. It was a period defined by what the men on the decks called muddling through. In the air-conditioned war rooms of Pearl Harbor and Brisbane, a strategic friction developed. The drive through the Central Pacific and the push through the Southwest created a logistical tug-of-war. The escort carriers were the rope. They were no longer just ferries. They were being shoved into the front lines of the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. The High Command wanted to see if these Kaiser Coffins could actually hold a punch. The Navy was operating on a steep, lethal learning curve. They were trading the security of rear base anchorages for a chaotic reality where doctrine was written in the blood of green crews. In the pre-dawn blackness of November 24, 1943, off the coast of Makin Island, that learning curve reached its most horrific peak. The USS Liscombe Bay was part of a task group that was, in the words of its own officers, ragged. A botched formation turn had left a gaping hole in the ship's perimeter. 2 destroyers had been pulled from the escort screen, leaving the carrier exposed. Lieutenant Commander Sunao Tabata, peering through the periscope of a Japanese submarine, did not need a second invitation. At 05:10 hours, he released a spread of torpedoes into the dark. Inside the Liscombe Bay, the morning was beginning with the mundane sounds of a ship coming to life. In the officers' quarters, Captain John G. Crommelin Jr. was standing naked in the shower. The lukewarm water was a rare luxury in the heat of the Pacific. Below him, in the engine room, the black gang wrestled with the steam engines. The air was thick with the smell of grease and recycled oxygen. Suddenly, a lookout scream cut through the salt air. Torpedo! Torpedo off the starboard beam. The impact was not a thud, but a cataclysm. The torpedo did not just hit the hull, it found the ship's Achilles heel. Stored deep in the belly were over 200,000 pounds of aerial bombs. The resulting detonation transformed the Liscombe Bay into a literal blast furnace. In an instant, the interior of the ship became what survivors described as Dante's Inferno come to life. A pillar of bright orange flame erupted through the flight deck, reaching thousands of feet into the sky. The heat was so intense that the steel of the bridge began to glow a sickening cherry red. Captain John G. Crommelin Jr. was thrown from his shower by the sheer force of the overpressure. The blast stripped the skin from his back and shoulders in a single violent motion. Stunned and naked, he scrambled through a world that had turned into a roaring tunnel of fire. Above him, on the bridge, Task Group Commander Admiral Henry M. Mullinix and Captain Irving D. Wiltsey were trapped. Wiltsey, a man of rigid naval tradition, made a choice that would haunt the survivors for decades. He turned and walked directly back into the wall of flame to check on his men, disappearing forever into the white-hot haze. The ship did not sink so much as it dissolved. For 23 minutes, the Liscombe Bay sat on the water, hissing and gurgling, as the ocean rushed into its shattered guts. Sailors on the deck found themselves in a sensory nightmare. The air was filled with the sizzle of burning torpex and the screams of men trying to climb superheated steam lines to escape the rising water. Firefighters exhausted their carbon dioxide bottles in seconds, against a fire that was melting the very deck beneath their boots. When the end finally came, the ship rolled and slid beneath the waves, leaving behind a scene of macabre horror. Ships, miles away, including the battleship New Mexico, were suddenly showered with a rain that defied description. It was not just soot and oil, it was deck fragments, bits of clothing, and charred human flesh that coated the superstructures of the rescue vessels. Amidst this carnage, miracles emerged from the black oil. Pilot Frank Sistrunk had undergone an appendectomy just 6 days prior. He ignored his tearing stitches and leaped into the water, treading oil and desperately begging for a rubber boat to help pull others from the slick. Crommelin, still naked and coated in a thick layer of fuel oil, swam for 90 minutes in the dark. His mind was a blank slate of survival, until he was finally hauled over the gunwales of a destroyer. The loss of the Liscum Bay was a psychological reckoning for the entire escort carrier program. It stripped away any lingering illusions about the safety of these vessels. They were now confirmed as 2 torpedo ships. They were fragile, combustible, and operating in a world where the 1,000-yard stare was the only common currency. The Navy was forced to rethink everything: magazine stowage, escort protocols, and the sheer, brutal cost of using merchant hulls to fight a carrier war. The jeeps had proven they were essential, but as the fleet turned toward the Marshall Islands, every man on board knew they were the most expendable targets in the Pacific. But the tragedy of the Macon coast did not slow the gears of American industry, it only accelerated them. By the spring of 1944, the American war machine had ceased to be a mere industrial effort and had become a geological force. In the sprawling soot-stained shipyards of Vancouver and Richmond, Henry Kaiser's assembly lines were hemorrhaging steel. A new Casablanca-class escort carrier was launched every 5 days. These were the Kaiser Coffins, mass-welded and powered by temperamental, rattling Uniflow engines. But they were arriving in numbers that defied Japanese mathematics. This was the birth of the Carrier Transport Squadron, Pacific, a logistical leviathan that turned the ocean into a high-speed conveyor belt. Between the summer of 1944 and the end of the war, this squadron would steam over 2 million miles. They delivered 30,000 aircraft and enough cargo to fill the skyline of a major city. But for the men stationed on these ferries, the country club atmosphere of the rear area supply runs was a fragile illusion. That illusion shattered the moment the fleet turned toward the Marianas. The reality of life on these logistical anvils was defined by a brutal, mechanical intimacy. On the pitching decks of ships like the Kitcon Bay and the Fanshawe Bay, the FM-2 Wildcat was the primary currency. It was a docile beast once it caught the air, but on the narrow, oil-slicked wooden planks of a jeep carrier, it was a bear to handle. The landing gear required 26 to 30 frantic manual cranks of a steel handle to lock into place. This was a grueling physical tax on pilots already vibrating with adrenaline. In the cockpit of one such Wildcat, Ensign Johnny Thompson experienced the terrifying instability that haunted the class. As he fought to bring the plane down, his radio cord snagged on the gear handle. The tension ratcheted his head down toward the instrument panel with every jerk of the aircraft. He was effectively blind, his neck pinned to the cockpit floor by his own equipment. He felt the violent thud-thud-thud of the arresting wires as he prayed the instability of the plane would not flip him into the catwalks. This was the frontline squalor of the transport pilots. These men were expected to perform with the precision of fleet carrier veterans while operating on platforms that felt like they were held together by industrial welds. As the invasion of Saipan loomed in June 1944, this logistical machine was forced into a bureaucratic bottleneck that nearly proved fatal. The commander of support aircraft, Captain Richard Whitehead, had centralized all air control into a single, rigid node. It was a blizzard of paperwork and radio congestion that paralyzed real-time response. While the fast carriers hunted the Japanese fleet in the open sea, the jeeps were shoved into the restricted lethal waters near the shore. They were tasked with providing close air support that land-based bombers could not manage in the volatile tropical weather. The air was thick with catapult anxiety. Army P-47 pilots were unused to the violent, steam-driven jerk of a carrier launch. They paced the decks with white faces, staring at the dark, churning water. They wondered if their heavy thunderbolts would simply sink like stones the moment they left the bow. The tension of this bottleneck crystallized on the evening of June 17, 1944, aboard the Fanshawe Bay. The sun was dipping toward the horizon, casting a deceptive roseate hue across the Philippine Sea. Suddenly, the radar screens blossomed with hostile contacts. The blizzard of papers on the signal bridge was swept away by the wind as the ship began violent emergency maneuvers. A Japanese bomber, slipping through the chaotic air defense, bracketed the carrier. There was no time for a warning. A 250-pound bomb struck the aft elevator with a sound like a mountain collapsing. The interior of the Fanshawe Bay was instantly transformed into a sensory nightmare. In the hangar deck, the repair party was simply erased. 11 men vanished in a flash of heat and jagged steel. A fire main ruptured, and the smell of burning gasoline mingled with the acrid, metallic tang of vaporized seawater. Below decks, the black gang in the engine room felt the ship stagger as if hit by a giant's hammer. In the smoke-choked darkness, sailors scrambled to push wrecked Wildcats overboard. Their boots slipped on blood and hydraulic fluid as they worked. The ship's 5-inch stern gun hammered away with a rhythm that felt like it was tearing the hull apart. They were operating in a hornet's nest. They were trapped between the rigid demands of a centralized command and the raw violence of an enemy that refused to be bypassed. But could these small, unarmored ships survive the coming storm of the largest naval battle in history? To understand that, we must look at the convergence of chaos waiting in the Philippine Sea. By the time the fires were suppressed, the Fanshawe Bay was a charred, listing testament to the vulnerability of the escort carrier program. The Aleutian stare had returned to the eyes of the crew. It was that hollow, unblinking look of men who had seen the blast furnace of the Liscum Bay and realized a terrifying truth. Despite the industrial miracle of the Kaiser shipyards, they were still just 2 torpedo targets. They were the indispensable backbone of the Marianas campaign and the architects of a victory that the heavy fleet carriers would eventually claim. But as the oil slicks of Saipan began to spread, the men of the jeep carriers knew the bureaucratic bottleneck was only the beginning of a much longer, bloodier road toward the heart of the Japanese Empire. The strategic architecture of the Leyte invasion was built on a foundation of opportunistic assessment that bordered on recklessness. Admiral William F. Halsey, fueled by reports of crumbling Japanese resistance, had effectively tossed the Navy's original, cautious invasion plans into a trash can of history. He accelerated the assault, creating a dangerous siloing of command. While the 7th Fleet under Admiral Thomas C. Kinkaid moved into the Gulf, Halsey's 3rd Fleet, the heavy muscle of the Pacific, became fixated on a decoy force of Japanese carriers to the north. This left the San Bernardino Strait, the back door to the invasion beaches, wide open. It was a failure of communication so profound that Kinkaid operated under the total, lethal assumption that the strait was guarded by a wall of steel. In reality, there was nothing there but the morning mist. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon on October the 25th, 1944, the men of Taffy 3 were emerging from the country club routine of the previous days. They were eating breakfast on rain-swept decks, unaware of the nightmares steaming toward them. Now, we return to that slate-grey morning off Samar, to the moment the radar screens of the White Plains blossomed with ghost blips that refused to vanish. The theater curtain of the mist peeled back, and the jeep carrier crews found themselves staring at the impossible. They saw the massive pagoda masts of Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, led by the 70,000-ton Titan, the Yamato. The silence of the dawn was shattered by the Great Dane roar of 18-inch guns. The ocean around the vulnerable carriers erupted in a technicolor nightmare of neon pink, yellow and green dye markers used to track the fall of giant shells. The flight decks of Taffy 3 instantly transformed into a scene of frantic, high-stakes improvisation. There was no time to arm planes with the proper torpedoes or armor-piercing bombs. Airbosses screamed over the roar of wind and engines for the pilots to get off the deck with anything they had. Pilots scrambled into cockpits, some launching with nothing but depth charges meant for submarines. Others carried small anti-personnel bombs, and several took off with no ammunition at all. Lieutenant Junior Grade Duggan and his fellow Avenger pilots took to the sky in a state of numbing desperation. Once they had expended their meager ordnance, these pilots did not head for safety. They began dummy runs, diving through a wall of flak and the angry red lines of tracers. They screened toward the Japanese battleships at masthead height with empty bomb bays. This forced the behemoths to break their gunnery solutions and take violent evasive maneuvers. It was a psychological war of nerves, where a pilot's sheer audacity was the only weapon left in the rack. Below the circling planes, the small boys, the destroyers and destroyer escorts, initiated a defense that remains the naval equivalent of the charge of the Light Brigade. Commander Ernest E. Evans of the Johnston, a man who had once sworn he would never retreat from an attempt to achieve a victory, did not wait for orders. He turned his 2,100-ton ship toward the entire Japanese line. The Johnston drove at 30 knots into a caliper straddle of heavy shells. The ship's 5-inch guns barked with the yip of a terrier against the heavy thud of the Japanese 14 inches. The sensory landscape was overwhelming. There was the sharp smell of cordite and the throaty roar of the Yamato. On the destroyer Heermann, the crew suffered through the nauseating smell of pulverized navy beans after a shell struck the storage locker, coating the men in a thick grey paste. The charge led by Evans was contagious. It pulled the Hoel and the Samuel B. Roberts into a suicide run that physically disrupted the Japanese formation. This bold move neutralized the dreaded long-lance torpedoes before they could find the carriers. This tactical audacity triggered a psychological collapse within the Japanese command. Admiral Kurita, already suffering from profound physical exhaustion and the trauma of losing his flagship days earlier, issued a general attack order. This directive was a fatal error. It abandoned disciplined, coordinated formation for an every-man-for-himself approach. In the soup of the smokescreens and rain squalls, the Japanese captains lost track of their targets and each other. Kurita began to see phantom fleets in the mist. He became convinced he was engaging the heavy fleet carriers of the Third Fleet rather than a handful of unarmored jeeps. The Gambia Bay bore the brunt of this confusion. The carrier absorbed 15 direct hits as the crew worked in waist-deep water to keep the engines running. The ship eventually rolled over at 0907 hours as the Japanese raked the derelict hulk with fire. Yet, even as the Johnston finally succumbed, its captain saluting from the bridge as he went down, the tide had turned. At 0911, just as his cruisers reached point-blank range, Kurita's nerve broke. Obsessed with the fear of being trapped and hounded by what he believed was an overwhelming force, he ordered a general retirement. The Japanese fleet, the most powerful surface force ever assembled, turned and fled from a thin grey line of unarmored merchant hulls. The survival of the Taffy units was a miracle of frontline squalor over country club planning. The jeeps had done the impossible. They had held the line and saved the invasion beaches at the cost of the Gambia Bay and the heroic small boys. As the battered survivors were plucked from the shark-infested waters, the perception of the escort carrier was irrevocably altered. Men like Ensign Leo Ziola spent hours shivering as the wind cut like glass waiting for rescue. These ships were no longer the discarded experiments or the sluggish afterthoughts of the Oval Office. They were the combat-hardened architects of the Pacific victory. They proved that in the Technicolor fire of Samar, the baby flat-top had developed teeth that could bite back at giants. But the adrenaline of the David and Goliath victory had barely begun to cool when the nature of the Pacific War changed forever. At 10:50 hours on October 25, 1944, the men of Taffy 3 were still shaking from the encounter with Kurita's battleships. They watched the Japanese retreat into the morning haze, feeling a brief sense of relief. On the flight deck of the USS St. Lo, the crew was working with a frantic, exhausted efficiency to recover and rearm their planes. The relief of having survived the Yamato was absolute then. A lookout spotted a lone Zeke aircraft banking out of the clouds. It was not performing a standard dive-bombing run. It was coming in flat and fast, its engine screaming at a pitch that set teeth on edge. The ship's 20mm guns opened up in a staccato rhythm. But the pilot did not flinch. He slammed his aircraft directly into the center of the flight deck. The propeller of the Zeke chewed through the wooden planks before the fuselage vanished into the hangar below. The era of the divine wind had arrived. At first, the damage seemed manageable. A plume of oily smoke rose from the hull, and the fire crews rushed forward with their hoses. But as they turned the valves, the St. Lo's fatal design flaw betrayed them. The ship's fire mains had been constructed with brittle cast-iron fittings rather than flexible steel. The shock of the impact had shattered these pipes like glass throughout the hull. Instead of a high-pressure torrent to quench the flames, the firefighters were met with a pathetic, dying trickle. Below decks, the fire became ravenous, hunting through the hangar where 72 bombs and 8 torpedoes sat exposed. At 10:58, a series of 7 secondary explosions tore the ship apart from the inside out. The sizzle of burning explosives gave way to a dazzling white flame as the magazine detonated, blowing the aft elevator hundreds of feet into the air. Captain McKenna stood on a bridge that was rapidly becoming an island in a sea of fire. He watched as a lone bugler stayed at his post, sounding abandoned ship until the deck began to roll beneath them. The St. Lo went down by the stern in a shroud of steam. She was the first formal victim of the kamikaze, the divine wind that had finally arrived to replace conventional naval doctrine with industrial suicide. By the spring of 1945, this new reality had transformed the Pacific into a meat grinder of attrition. The focus shifted to Okinawa, where the jeep carriers were no longer just supporting the fleet. They were the shield. Stationed in the scabrous waters of Suicide Gulch, the escort carriers faced the floating chrysanthemum strategy. Massed waves of hundreds of suicide planes were designed to saturate American defenses. For the crews, the country club was a memory from another life. They lived in a state of frontline squalor, enduring a punishing routine where pilots flew until they literally collapsed in their cockpits. It was common to see a Wildcat land and the engine cut out, only for the deck crew to find the pilot slumped over the stick. His eyes would be open in the Okinawa stare, his body too exhausted to even unbuckle his own harness. The psychological weight of this campaign was punctuated by the emergence of a new, terrifying weapon, the Bucker bomb. This was a rocket-propelled, human-guided missile, carried to the target zone by a mother bomber and then released to scream toward the fleet at over 400 miles per hour. Sailors on the Wake Island and the Lunga Point described the sound of an approaching Bucker as a high-pitched, unnatural shriek that seemed to vibrate the very marrow of their bones. Unlike the standard Japanese fighters, which could be swatted down by a lucky 40mm burst, the Bucker was a comet of fire that was nearly impossible to intercept. When one struck the destroyer Manat El Abil, the ship did not just sink, it disintegrated. The hull snapped under the kinetic energy of a weapon that traded a human life for a guaranteed hit. The sensory landscape of Okinawa was a typhoon of steel. The air was a permanent haze of black flak bursts and the yellowish flash of suicide planes detonating against steel hulls. On the Sangamon, the tension reached a breaking point on May 4, 1945. A suicide plane penetrated the flight deck, triggering a gaseous explosion that filled the ship with the metallic tang of vaporized ammunition. The black gang in the engine room worked in total darkness, navigating by the shuddering of the hull as near misses sent geysers of water over the stacks. They fought the fires for hours, men crawling through the sizzling foam and heat to save a ship that was never meant to survive such a concentrated hell. As the battered, charred Sangamon finally limped away from the line, her crew looked back at the funeral pyre of the Japanese Air Force. They realized the jeep carriers had evolved. They were no longer the vulnerable, expendable afterthoughts of 1942. They were the scarred, indispensable veterans of a war that had moved beyond the reach of traditional admirals. They stood as the final, blood-soaked barrier between the empire and the end of the world. The atomic flashes over Hiroshima and Nagasaki did more than shatter the Japanese empire. They created an immediate, staggering logistical vacuum across the largest ocean on Earth. For the crews of the jeep carriers, the transition from the typhoon of steel to the silence of peace was not a celebratory homecoming. It was a final, grueling metamorphosis. The vessels that had been built as expendable stopgaps were suddenly the only things capable of bridging the 10,000-mile gap between the front lines and the front porches of America. This was the birth of the Magic Carpet Fleet. It was an operation that turned the combustible warships into massive, floating dormitories. By October of 1945, the hangar deck of the USS Chenango had been transformed. The warplanes were gone, replaced by rows of triple-stacked bunks that stretched from bulkhead to bulkhead. The men boarding the ship were no longer the green farm boys of 1942. They were the recovered prisoners of war who had survived the nightmare of Japanese labor camps. On the pier, the sensory contrast was overwhelming. The sailors, still wearing their salt-crusted dungarees, watched as these shadow men shuffled into the belly of the ship. They were emaciated and wore a stare that went deeper than any combat fatigue. The air in the hangar deck, once sharp with the tang of cordite, now hung heavy with the smell of stale tobacco and medicinal soap. 5,000 men shared the same space, many unable to believe the blast furnace of the war had finally cooled. The danger, however, had not entirely evaporated. In late 1945, as the Chenango churned through the Philippine Sea, it ran headlong into a final, vengeful typhoon. The sea transformed once again into a grey wall of water. Below decks, the thousands of soldiers clung to their bunks as the ship recorded terrifying rolls of nearly 40 degrees. The Kaiser-class hull groaned, the mass-welded seams shrieking under the torque of 75-foot waves. In the darkness of the hangar, a nightmare of relative motion unfolded. Several massive aircraft tires, left over from the carrier's combat days, broke loose from their moorings. These 100-pound black boulders began to bounce 15 feet in the air with every roll, thumping against the steel bulkheads and tiered bunks. The soldiers who had survived snipers and kamikazes found themselves scrambling for their lives in the dark. They were dodging rubber projectiles in a ship that had traded its teeth for the weight of human cargo. This was the final, unglamorous toll of the escort carrier program. While the fast carriers enjoyed the grandstand seats of history, the jeeps remained the Pony Express riders of the Pacific until the very end. By March of 1946, this thin grey line had transported over 1,300,000 personnel home. They had functioned as the technicolor anvil of the war. They were the versatile, high-risk platforms that had bridged the gap between raw industrial power and the ground-level blood of the island-hopping campaign. They had been the ones to pull the plug on the Japanese submarine fleet with their torpedoes and mortars. And they had been the ones to stand in the hornet's nest off Samar when the big shots were nowhere to be found. The end for these ships did not arrive with the thunderous roar of battleship guns. Instead, it came with the quiet, rhythmic clink of a welder's torch. By 1946, the jeeps were being led into the ghost fleets of the Atlantic and the Pacific. Their flight decks were stripped of their signaling gear, and their 5-inch stern guns were unbolted and hauled away. In the mothball yards, the silence was absolute. The sizzle of burning explosives and the high-pitched whine of the gun mounts were gone. They were replaced by the eerie, hollow echo of the wind blowing through empty ventilation shafts. Some of these vessels, like the Long Island, were sold off to become merchant ships or floating dormitories in European harbors. Their warlike origins were buried under thick layers of civilian paint. Others were simply towed to the breakers. The very steel that had been labeled expendable was melted down to build the suburbs where the returning soldiers now lived. As the decades passed, the story of the fast carriers often obscured the brutal reality of the escort carriers. History books painted the Pacific War as a tale of sleek, invincible giants. But for the veterans who returned to the waters off Makin, Samar, and Okinawa to drop wreaths into the deep, the truth remained visceral. They remembered the cherry-red glow of the bridge on the Liscum Bay. They remembered the thick, nauseating paste of navy beans coating the deck of the Heermann. They remembered the terrifying shuddering of a hull that was never meant to survive the divine wind of the kamikaze. These men knew that victory had been forged by a fleet of discarded experiments. It was won by the sailors and pilots who had the tenacity to fly these ships directly into the fire. The legacy of the Jeep carrier is not found in the museums or the textbooks. It lives in the quiet realization of the survivors who look at the horizon and whisper, "By God, I survived." They were the indispensable, scarred veterans of a war that had demanded everything from the vulnerable and the expendable. They proved that these little giants were the true foundation upon which the peace was built. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories for the generations to come. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.